Suspiria is a 1977 horror film directed by Dario Argento. It is also a fairy tale with all the trappings and history that comes with that. Susie Banyan, an American dancer, arrives in Germany to study dance at a prestigious academy. Upon arrival, she meets, in passing, a woman who is murdered. As Susie settles in, she notices a lot of strange occurrences at the academy. She learns that the school was once inhabited by a woman who locals believed was a witch. Susie discovers a secret passage that reveals the witch. She defeats her, and the other followers of the witch apparently die without their queen, and the entire academy burns. Suspiria checks many of the boxes of classic fairy tales, including the horrors that have long since been sanitized into our current understanding of said tales. The dance academy is in a dark forest, such as in Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, and countless other fairy tales that use the forest as a symbol of the unknown. Susie is wearing white while standing in the rain, the virginal sacrifice who requires rescuing from a good prince. In this case, a prince that will not come. Susie passes out due to the malevolence of the coven of witches, akin to sleeping spells in Snow White and Sleeping Beauty. In the beginning, during the credits, a narrator gives us an opening that may as well begin with Once Upon a Time. In the end, Susie burns the witches and their home in the name of the virginal innocent. But there is another aspect to fairy tales that is part of the DNA of this film: the portrayal of women. Is Suspiria better off for having so much in common with a fairy tale, or is the film, and many other horror films, a product of something that reinforces negative stereotypes on society? A survey of classic fairy tales that are still commonly told in the Western world yields a distinct trend that focuses on validating women through submissive beauty, while men are portrayed as active and violent. Fairy tales are not only reflections of societal values, but are actually tools that perpetuate patriarchal concepts that maintain gender hierarchy. Their influence does not end in the storybook, though. Fairy tales, and other classic literature, have influenced modern storytelling, including movies, by being the bedrock upon which later stories were built. Movies, especially horror movies, thrive on exploiting the stereotypes that tie together sexuality and violence that children are initially exposed to through fairy tales. When the Brothers Grimm collected their fairy tales over a century ago, they gathered the stories predominantly from German women, mostly spinners who worked communally. This was to preserve stories in the oral tradition for future generations. The stories underwent changes from their original source, women, into the domain of patriarchal Germany. Many tales originally contained ancestral rape or attempted rape by the father, but this was replaced by the male authors with a stepmother character instead that resents the protagonist's beauty. In Suspiria, beauty is commonly referenced. Susie is told she is beautiful when she arrives at the dance school. The antagonist of the film is a burned, ancient witch with grotesque features. The other villains are secretive, older women, one in particular a kind of matronly, conventionally unattractive woman who preys on the young, pretty girls who dance at the school. This is the wicked stepmother figure in practice, if not in name. Director Dario Argento has said of this, "I like women, especially beautiful ones. If they have a good face and figure, I would much prefer to watch them being murdered than an ugly girl or man. I certainly don't have to justify myself to anyone about this. I don't care what anybody thinks or reads into it." Well, if Argento does not care what anybody thinks or reads into it, he will not mind if we do just that. The lead characters in fairy tales are usually women, possibly because they were originally told by women. The reader is typically able to determine a character's morality based on their physical appearance. These are written down in the 19th century and had their roots in centuries long before, which meant that the most important attribute a woman could possess was her attractiveness. This patriarchal attitude bled into fairy tales, even those told by women, due to what is sometimes called internalized misogyny. Take Snow White, for example. The father marries a new woman, a wicked stepmother, who becomes envious of Snow White's beauty. According to the co-screenwriter of Suspiria, Susie is based on Snow White. Her beauty is envied by older women, and this puts her in danger. Susie is the naive, innocent, tormented by an evil witch. Women who are not beautiful in fairy tales are suspicious. The beautiful queen disguises herself as an old peddler to get close to Snow White. A good woman submissively accepts her role in life while waiting for a prince to appear and control her. In Suspiria, this is not entirely true though. Its cast is mostly women, and the parts for men are all for supporting roles, mostly cameos. This may have something to do with one of the screenwriters being a woman herself, much in the way that fairy tales were largely about women due to the German women who helped the Brothers Grimm collect them. The prince of the story is the pair of intellectuals who tell Susie about witches. Before this, she was suspicious but ignorant. The problematic elements of Suspiria have nothing to do with casting. There are lots of roles for women in this film. The issue, instead, is how they are portrayed. The characters are drawn terribly thinly and contain stereotypical Madonna whore or virgin crone dichotomy. The Madonna whore complex began in psychoanalysis, referencing men's inability to see women as either innocent virgins or vile, debased prostitutes, with nothing in between. This societal attitude creeps into movies, particularly horror movies, all the time. In Suspiria, we certainly see this dichotomy played out both visually and narratively. This attitude is entrenched in fairy tales as well. If the protagonist is good and beautiful, then the evil character must exhibit the opposite physical appearance. There are exceptions, of course, but they are rare. Villains also exhibit traits that threaten 19th century feminine ideals, meaning instead of passive, they are strong-willed and have their own desires besides that of marriage. In Suspiria, witches are described as wanting to acquire great wealth for themselves and had great ambitions. This is in contrast to the fairy tale feminine ideal. So let's go back to Argento's admitted desire to watch beautiful women get killed. One death in the film is a man, but it should be noted that a lot of the violence is happening off-screen or at a distance, whereas the opening death scene is among the most graphic in horror movie history. She is beaten, stabbed, hanged, and then she bleeds out. Now, of course, it's a horror movie. People generally die in films of its genre, and some films even handle it quite well. But there is this bizarre sense of voyeurism towards the objectified female body in Suspiria. In the film, the murderer does not stalk the women. The camera does. Admittedly, it's a film where women are not sexualized. After all, there is almost no direct mention of sex, and certainly no sex scenes, but it is a film in which women are mutilated instead. It's a film in which women are active and have all the starring roles, yes, but they are empowered through a man's narrow vision of what female empowerment can be. Susie is not ambitious. Instead, she kills the woman who is ambitious, and that woman is depicted as a witch to drive that point home. It is a film in which women punish each other, which is also another feature in fairy tales. In modern times, fairy tales have been adapted into film, most notably by Disney. They are highly sanitized versions, yes, but many of them still contain the ethos of fairy tales as it relates to women. Suspiria is anything but sanitized. It is more in line with the gruesome narratives of earlier versions of the same fairy tales that Disney got its hands on, and yet it delivers similar lessons. Classic fairy tale literature, not all of it, but a lot of it, reinforces the idea that women should be wives and mothers, that they should be submissive and self-sacrificing. Good women in stories are silent, lacking ambition, and are always eager to marry. Snow White is so innocent that she is deprived of developing independence. In Suspiria, there are not enough men for Susie to even consider marriage, but her portrayal and subsequently the portrayal of her adversaries ties in neatly with stock fairy tale features. Opposition to this usually comes in the form of arguments from tradition. It has always been this way. But that is actually an argument against it, and evidence that everyone knows it has in fact always been like this, to the detriment of women and society in general. Fairy tales change depending on the biases of the interpreter. The Brothers Grimm changed the male villain with a female one, and said villainesses were ugly, envious, and generally old. Disney went a step further, giving the audience visuals. Argento went further still, bringing the ugly side of these stories to the forefront, but not in a way that examines it, only perpetuates it. Not all fairy tale movies embody these negative traits, of course. Pan's Labyrinth, for example, handles the material far more responsibly and distances itself from said traits. Fairy tales influence the minds of children, and as they grow, these concepts evolve into their worldview. For an adult fairy tale like Suspiria, or really any film that contains these traits, it merely reinforces that already well-established view. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next week.